Hello everyone, good morning. Before we start, Ma'am Pao, let's just ask our colleague, si Professor Bernie. Sir, nandiyan na po ba si Sir Ryan?
Yes po, nandito na po siya.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we can start now. Our all our presenters are here now. Okay, so we're live at YouTube now. To our colleagues, friends, and guests who are with us today, a pleasant morning. We are now opening our 18th panel in this international conference of Cordillera Studies with the theme on historical narratives in indigenous communities. I will be your moderator for this panel, Jose Matthew Luga, instructor in history at the University of the Philippines, Baguio. And joining me will be Miss Paula Pamintuan of the Cordillera Studies Center as our assistant moderator. Before we start our parallel session, we would like to remind our participants in this session of the following reminders. We hope that you can please observe the following. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking to eliminate background noise and prevent disruptions during our session. Please turn off your camera if your video may disrupt our or distract others, or if you have an unstable internet connection. Do not crosstalk. Use the Zoom feature for raising a hand or show your physical hand in front of your camera, and speak only when recognized by the moderator. Please feel free to ask for help from our assistant moderator, Ma'am Paula Pamintuan, if you need any assistance. You can do this by directly messaging her using the chat box feature of the Zoom. Please do not post the Zoom meeting details for this panel on social media to prevent unscrupulous individuals from intruding the online meeting. You can share the live stream link instead. Certificates will be distributed after the conference. To get a certificate, participants should complete the evaluation form. The conference evaluation form will be available at the end of the conference on July 26, 2021. Attendance will be monitored by the conference technical team. As for our questions for the panel members, please feel free to send them at the question and answer chat box feature of the Zoom room. You may also opt to send your questions directly to me should you wish to stay anonymous using the direct message feature of the Zoom chat box. Please be reminded, however, that all these questions shall be asked after all video presentations have been played. Nevertheless, do not hesitate to send them while we are playing the video presentations. So, to begin our panel, let me introduce our first panel presenter. First panel presenters, actually two in this paper. They are Professors Ryan Alvin Pawilen and Professor Bernardo M. Arellano III, who will be co-presenting a paper entitled Umali Kayo, Revisiting Ethnic Relations of Cordillerans and Ilocanos through Mapping Settlement Narratives from the 1950s Archives. Mr. Ryan Alvin M. Pawilen is an assistant professor from the Department of Social Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. He earned his bachelor's degree in social sciences, major in social anthropology, and minor in psychology from UP Baguio. He earned his MA in Philippine Studies from UP Diliman. He is currently taking his PhD in history in UP Diliman. His co-presenter, Professor Bernardo M. Arellano III, is also an assistant professor of the Department of Social Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences at UP Los Baños. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from UP Visayas and earned his MS Geography, Masters of Science from UP Diliman. His research interests include placemaking and place studies, local history, and cultural heritage studies. So let us all watch the video presentation of Professors Pawilen and Arellano on their paper Umali Kayo. Thank you.
Yan, good day, magandang araw, and naimbag nga aldaw kada tayo amin. I am Ryan Alvin Pawilan, and this is my colleague, Mr. Bernardo Arellano III, and we are both representing the Department of Social Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences, University of the Philippines, Los Baños. And this is Umali Kayo, Revisiting Ethnic Relations of Cordillerans and Ilocanos through mapping settlement narratives from the 1950s archives. Basically, we want to contribute to the literature or research on intercultural studies and interactions of various ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines, such as the relationship between the Cordillerans or Igorots and the Ilocanos. Studying such interactions should make us reconsider our academic application of such concepts of space such as Ilaya and Ilawod, upland and lowland, Tagadaya, Tagalaod, and the like. In this presentation, we use the accounts of the 1950s historical data papers, treating them more as memories or worldviews rather than exact or academic history. We also utilize the GIS mapping to further visualize these memories. In a way, this paper is also a test of the 1950s historical data papers as a source of knowledge and of mapping as a tool for social scientists in doing research on cultural interaction. At the end, what we really want to show is that there were at least memories of movement from among the Ilocanos and the Cordillerans in Ilocos Sur and Norte, opening up reimaginations of ethnicity and revisiting our notions of geographic boundaries. The academy's perspective of ethno-linguistic interaction has changed through time, but the idea of fixed geographical demarcations still exists that somehow fuels narratives of exclusion or isolation. On a separate paper that I did for a graduate class, for example, most of the legislative documents still represent indigenous people as situated mainly in mountainous regions. And some even imply that ethnicity is something pure, like migrations and intermarriage were not taken into consideration. Thus, migration and settlement were highlighted in this paper, although they are also the easiest to determine in the HDP or the historical data papers, since the information is one of the first to be written or reported in the HDP suggested format. The historical data papers seem to have a bad reputation. One, because of who made the research. First, we argue that we find it insulting that the work of Filipino teachers is treated harshly compared to when a foreigner makes such statements, accurate or not. Second, we seem to forget to consider the historical context and the goal of the HDP, which is after World War II, when a lot of the archives were destroyed. The former Bureau of Education had the most personnel around the islands, thus they were the crucial uh, agency in the rebuilding process in general of the country. And the former President Quirino provided a format to be followed, like what is being done right now by NCCA's cultural mapping, and that of the 1950s was not the first because the Americans also did a similar study way back in the 1930s, but were allegedly destroyed, mostly destroyed during the World War II in the Philippines. Third, the critics seem to forget that it is not just about who documented the reports, but more importantly, the memories and experiences of the key informants or each community. Our role as researchers, therefore, is to continue shifting or sifting through the details, continue the process of data gathering and data processing and see how they made sense, how the people made sense of their world and basically historicized their time during the early 1950s and the preceding years. Thus, the HDP is not a perfect source, but is still a significant one. We may not treat the papers as official history, but if we approach them as memories, they are important sources of knowledge. The limitations here, however, is that there are no reports from the Cordilleras. So this presentation is mainly focused on the papers or reports from Ilocos Sur and Norte. On mapping, yes, we argue that memories can be mapped if we treat them as narratives. Human and cultural geography has been experimenting on mental maps, memories, counter mapping, art and maps, etc. And they have accepted memories and counter mapping as valid fields of research and knowledge. Space and place are significant aspects of both cultural and historical studies. And these are not neutral geographical environments, but they are also socially and politically constructed. The same with maps. The knowledge of maps and the skills of mapping could therefore provide us with both additional aspect of analysis as well as a way to represent our data. To further discuss this, Sir Arellano.
Thank you, Sir Ryan,
Yes.
for introducing me and also for introducing our study regarding mapping memories. When we use the historical data papers or the HDPs of the 1950s, the data provided us with the source and the origin and the what do you call this, the destination of their movements, and using those origins of movements, and at the same time we also use the non-Christian tribes
Uh,
map
that's
by
Cooper
that's Cooper.
Coles. Cooper Coles.
Yes,
Yeah.
so we use these as our overlay data overlays on determining where are these where are the origins and where are the destinations. In the first map that we see here is that movements in Ilocos Norte, we trace those data that comes from the HDP, and they cited towns or communities that have quote and unquote original Ilocanos, migrant Ilocanos. You have also the migrant Itneg and the Tingian or the Yapayao, which we collaborated into one. And we also have the others.
Yeah.
So this one is in the Ilocos Norte. And most of the movement from the indigenous peoples of the Cordilleras are coming from the Itneg or the Tingian and the Yapayao. So most of the migration comes from Aber River Valley, going to the towns of Nueva Era, to actually in Nueva Era and Banna area. So it's on the it's on the southeast portion of Ilocos Norte. On the other hand, the Yapayao, which dominates the area of the Apayao region, of the Apayao province, they migrated closely enough to the northeastern section of the of Ilocos Norte. And then we can also see the movements of the Ilocanos in their heartland. That's what we call it, the heartland, which is in the lowlands. We can see the movements coming in from the coastal towns going interior. There are movements coming in from other places, such as in Lawag, going inside or going inland, further inland towards Dingras and Sarat. So these areas, they have this movement that is going on. It's not just static, but it's moving. Internal movements within the traditional Ilocano towns and cities, we can see in the map. And they came from mostly of the capital cities and the coastal towns. The Cordilleran IPs, such as the Yapayao and the Itneg or the Tingians, they move towards Ilocos Norte, but not really on the coastal towns. It's just beside their traditional areas, what they call it. And however, in the HPD, we also notice that there are outlier origins, such as in Lanao and Abaca in Bangi, wherein the HPD mentioned that their origin came from the Aita or from the Negritos. For the sake of this study, we divided into the legislative districts, which is the northern Ilocos Sur and the southern Ilocos Sur. So first, we go on to the first district. As what you can see, the Tingians and the Itnegs migrated towards Ilocos Sur, the coastal towns. They also migrated towards Santa. They also migrated towards Vigan. Another fact that we can see here is that we do also have other outliers, such as seafarers, Chinese, and undetermined groups. In the example of vegan, uh, you have a, we have has been settled by Chinese settlers. And lastly, people coming in from Kawayan, in a town south of Vigan. They are identified as seafaring people, but the question of what seafaring people is all about is not clear in HPD, so we just have to label it as is. For the second district, as what you can see here based on the HPD maps, on the memories of the people, uh, most of the people from the interior towns of Ilocos Sur came or have origins from the Cordilleras. You have the Mountain Province IPs. You have the Tingian or the Itneg IPs that are determined here based on the HPD. And most of them have settled down in the interior parts, not on the coastal parts, but the interior parts of the second district. As one example here, there are mountain province IPs who settled in Sigay, which is a town in Ilocos Sur, interior Ilocos Sur. You also have um, a settlement in Salcedo. Like in Ilocos Norte, first, we also have outliers like seafarers, Chinese, and undetermined groups who settled in the area. So as we have already explained earlier, movements in Ilocos Sur, there are movements in the first district that are mostly from traditional Itneg or the Tinggi and to Ilocano lowland communities. This has an historical basis wherein the Ilawod Ilaya settlement, they have interactions. The people from Abra go to Bigan to sell their products, so on and so forth. There's also intra-town migration within the Abra River Delta that was been noted. So we have mentioned that there is a movement between the Ilocano settlements, such as in Ilocos Norte. There is also in Ilocos Sur, particularly in the Vigan area. Ancestry of foreign origin was also noted, as I have already mentioned, particularly in Vigan, given its historical association as the historical center of the Ilocandia province or the Ilocos region. And the second district, migration was mostly by the Cordillera IPs, not just only the Itneg and the Tingian, but also there are traces of mountain province IPs and the other indigenous groups or other groups. And again, there is movement in the Ilocano settlements, but unlike Ilocos Norte, there are kumbaga konti, there's only a few intra-Ilocano community migrations as compared to Ilocos Norte. The way that we map this using the GIS and using local knowledge and using data coming from the official records, when we read the HPD, they do not have the routes or they do not specify the routes of where they have passed through. That's why if you can see
Yeah.
in the maps, it's just only curving arrows coming from the origins all the way to the destinations, because in the HPD they did not specify what particular routes that they have used. So
Mhm.
this is a
Mhm.
very fertile discussion for what particular routes have they passed during the migration or during the movements of these peoples. Mr. Pawilen?
Yes. Recommendations. Compared, if we compare the maps to that of Cole's maps in 1909 on the non-Christian tribes, well, we have to change that now. No? Still, we can see that the areas of indigenous origins and movement somehow match. In human geography and counter mapping, maps are never finished. Thus, our mapping adds another layer to the map by Cole through presenting possible movements around the region. Further, we must also admit our positionality to the subject, meaning our maps were created in the current socio-political context using the existing political demarcations of territory. If we are to acquire more geographical information of the lands during or prior to the 1950s, we might actually see different geographical demarcations. Therefore, the movements might not even be between provinces or region, but within the indigenous areas. So, this brings us to another reimagination of the actual ancestral domains of the Cordilleras. The following. First, that despite romanticization of the idea of exclusion or isolation between ethno-linguistic groups, such as the relationship between the Ilocanos and the Cordillerans, we still have memories to disprove this notion and provide us with a picture which are more with pictures which are more dynamic, okay, in character, that these people interact, that these people move. Another one is that memories are still important sources of knowledge, and the HDP is a great source of memories. Right? We just need to know how to process the data. And the last one, at least for me, no?
Mhm,
Space and place are important aspects of cultural and historical studies. Thus,
mhm,
mapping should be included in any social scientist toolbox. Okay, whether it's the skill of making maps or reading maps. No? In fact, it is also high time for any social science department. Well, Sir Bernie came from the MS Geography department. I am taking my PhD and my cognate is geography. So we are promoting this one. No?
mhm.
It is high
Very
time
nice.
for social science departments around the Philippines to acknowledge and include the field of geography in their area, in their midst, as the idea of space or place have evolved already from being mere political and environmental territories. And I think the Philippines must catch up with those ideas. Sir Bernie,
Okay.
additional insights?
I think your insights is also my insights regarding geography in particular. But it's really a nice discussion about this places because about this project is because we can see the interaction of the people coming in from the uplands, coming in from lowlands.
Mm,
Um, we tend to understand where the context of the places, the culture, the influences. I think that will be all for me,
mhm.
Mr. Pawilan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for UP Baguio for accepting us and inviting us.
Thank you very much, UP Baguio.
Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation, Professors Arellano and Professors Pawilen. So in summary, if you look at their paper, Professors Pawilen and Arellano actually did a presentation on Cordillera and Ilocano ethnic relations using historical data papers by analyzing them through the geographical information system. Well, this research of theirs shows how using a geographical turn and a digital turn when examining historical data can help reify data, leading to new analysis. which may be glossed over in traditional research approaches. In particular to this paper, they showed how the study of migration with the use of maps can actually give us a new appreciation of ancestral domains when we may actually look beyond what we know, beyond what we are familiar with when we say Tingian domain. It may not just be only in Abra, but we may include, in fact, areas in the Ilocos area based on the historical data, which is reified through mapping. And I agree that we must incorporate mapping now in our historical researches. So it's a wonderful paper. Thank you for that, Professors Pawilan and Arellano. Our second paper is on commemorating Aguinaldo in Lubuagan, or foregrounding the Ilubuagans in the Filipino-American War. And this shall be presented by another colleague from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, Professor Jeffrey James C. Liegero. Professor Liegero holds an AB and an MA in History from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He worked as a high school teacher in Quezon City and as a cultural heritage researcher in Ilocos Sur before joining the Univer- Department of Social Sciences, University of the Philippines, Los Baños, where he teaches Rizal and history courses. His research interests include local and oral history, indigenous science and technology, colonial road building, and bus transportation history in the Philippines. He speaks Ilocano, loves to travel locally, and collects native baskets and hats. So let us now watch the presentation of our second speaker, Professor James Liegero.
It has been known that President Emilio Aguinaldo, accompanied by 168 soldiers, encamped in Lubuagan, then an ili or town of independent tribes which were incorporated in the province of Abra, but now part of Kalinga, for 72 days from March 6 to May 17, 1900, at the commence of the Filipino-American War. So much so that the province of Kalinga commemorated the centenary of Aguinaldo's sojourn in Lubuagan in 2000. The National Historical Institute installed a marker but with an inscription which only highlights the undertakings of the President and his men while in town. This historical marker, the only one in the province so far, has failed to cite the notable deeds of the citizens of Lubuagan who were stereotyped as ferocious and treacherous, but proven wrong by the historical encounter between the President of the Republic and the tribespeople during the hot season of 1900. The Ilubuagans gave full support and active assistance to Aguinaldo and his presidential guards, and by implication, the Filipino Republic. By welcoming the President, sheltering and cooperating with him, the Ilobuagans directly supported the war effort with due sacrifices of their personal and tribal interests. Their compliance and humble submission for the sake of the President of the Filipino government became their contribution to the cause of Philippine nationalism. In this regard, this research aims to furnish the unheard details of the Ilubuagans' noteworthy feats in connection with Aguinaldo's encampment in town, and to show that Ilubuagan hospitality and good nature are in congruence with their religious beliefs and traditions. The Ilubuagans' kindness to visitors and those seeking refuge was deeply rooted in the religious belief that would in peace, blessing, and tribe preservation. Despite their lack of experience of Spanish colonial rule, the Ilubuagans were productive in nation building. Any historical inquiry puts premium on the use of written materials produced by the persons who witnessed or partook in the events under study. The diaries of Dr. Simon Villa and Santiago Barcelona and Lieutenant Telesforo Carrasco, who comprised the staff of President Aguinaldo during his guerrilla war activities in northern Luzon against the U.S. Army from 1899 to 1901, are practically the only first-hand written accounts about Aguinaldo's encampment in Lubuagan. Since their translation and publication, these evidences have shaped the Filipinos' discernment of these historic events. But since the authors were certainly saving on ink and paper when they were writing their daily records, Villa, Barcelona, and Carrasco consequently showed only their side, or Aguinaldo's side of the story. The Ilubuagen seemed to play trivial roles in the story the way they were presented in the diaries. To enrich this traditional historical knowledge of Aguileju's coming to town, the author attempts to include the Ilubuagen side of the story, which is a cogent part of the narrative, engaging the oral accounts of Ilubuagens who had also witnessed and participated in these events. A large part of this research comes from the oral sources kept by present elder Ilubuagens, which the author believes must be given value as an alternative source of history, known as Ha Kalanja Iawi. These first-hand accounts of participants and eyewitnesses of the events that were preserved by oral transmission and handed down from their generation to the next are being endangered to oblivion. Thus, the importance of codifying these stories is very much needed. Hakalan Jaiyawi decipher the Ilubuagan point of view of the past. These oral accounts not only provide an alternative source for the writing of national and local history, but also a local perspective of the events with national significance. This paper humbly contributes to the preservation and promotion of the intangible cultural heritage of the indigenous peoples of Lubwagan Kalinga as a veritable treasure trove of credible sources of historical knowledge. When Ilubwagans talk about the past, they always say Ha Kalanja Iawi, which literally means according to our forebears, or what our forebears said. Hakalanjaiyawi categorically refer to hindsight verbal accounts from people of an earlier period of common heritage and with traceable genealogic relationship to the present elder Ilugwagans, to whom these first-hand oral accounts were transmitted, and who are now the keepers or bearers of these accounts, and who are the informants of the author. The concept of the Iawi or ancestors in this paper will cover the informant's grandparents, as they were already youngsters, adolescents, and adults at the time of Aguilejo's coming to town. The following slides enumerate the Hakalanja Iawi that were used as sources for this study. Now, allow me to describe Lubwagan as a place and people. Located in the Cordillera region north of Bontoc, Lubwagan's topography is mountainous. Its town proper has an elevation of 800 to 900 meters. It used to have a surplus of rice as Lubwagan harvested this staple food from its papayaw and uma thrice a year. It is surrounded by mountain ranges from three sides, making the town an ideal place of retreat and security. The Lubwagan tribe is one of the independent tribes which were later lumped together and given the collective name Kalinga. Members of the Lubwagan tribe refer to themselves as Ilubwagin. Mabungtot, Tanglad, and Uma later became separate tribes of the municipality. Lubwagan before 1900 was already a big town, as can be seen in this Spanish report in 1882. Lubwagan tribe's territory was bounded to the north by Tagibong and Dalupa, to the east by Tanglag and Mabungtot, to the south by Tulgao, Bangad, and Chalub or Sumabel, and to the west by Balatok. Oral tradition has it that before Aguinaldo, Lubwagan had already forged bujong or bilateral agreement with some of these neighboring tribes or towns and coexisted peacefully with others without instituting peace treatises because of kinship ties and intermarriage. Oral tradition further states that Ilubwagans were also at peace with those tribes located along the Tanudan River to the east and southeast, and with the Ibianao tribe along the Saltan River to the north. The Lubwagan tribe, among others, were initially branded as Ginaanes, or independent, savage, or hidden groups, and relentless headhunters inhabiting the watershed of Abra and Kayakayam rivers since the time of Guillermo Galvez expeditions. But despite this stigma of ferocity stamped on them, peaceful relations also developed between the Ilubuagens, Ilocanos, and Tingians due to intermarriage and trade. Some of the men of the tribe were accustomed to going to Kanjong, Lebiakan, Biangod, Bigan, and Lawag to trade. Ilubuagens were similarly bartering with Tuaw in Cagayan and Quiabiagen in Isabela. They frequented the lowland markets in pursuit of a trade in items which could not be produced or cannot be found in their mountain fastness, such as commercial metal like iron, copper, and bronze, big Ilocano earthenware jars, woven cotton textile, and imported beads. Expectably, the Ilobuagans learned to speak the Ilocano language, and they practically kept themselves abreast with political developments in the lowlands. Hakalanjaiyawi also have it that a pioneer settlement in Lubwagan called Matuon was deserted several times due to frequent family feuds, and some of the Imatuon families went to Bangged in search of greener pastures. Elder Ilubuagans can still recall those who moved to Abra's capital and who were assimilated to colonial culture, namely the Villamor, Bersamin, Damian, Valera, Alzate, and Paredes families. So the phenomenon of westward migration, intermarriage, and trade prior to 1900 brought the Ilubuagans closer to the Ilocanos and Tingians, gave them the opportunity to learn Ilocano, and taught them to become heavily dependent on the Ilocos coastal and Abra Valley towns, especially for their metal supply to be able to forge weapons, gongs, and farm implements. Their inter-regional mobility due to their active trade relations and kinship ties with the Ilocanos and Tingians made the Ilubuagan involvement in the Filipino cause inevitable. The Ilubuagans became sympathetic and supportive of the Filipino government when their relatives occupied the helm of the provincial government, including the military. Serving in the Spanish army at the start of the Philippine Revolution, Infantry Captain Blas Villamor defected to the Filipino side and together with Ilocanos and Tingians, liberated Bangged and Bigan of Spanish rule. He later became Brigadier General Manuel Quino's second in command for the entire Ilocos Brigade during the Filipino-American War. After Lieutenant Colonel Villamor surrendered to the enemy, he became instrumental in the success of American policy of attracting the independent tribes of Kalinga to which he belonged to submit to the authority of the new regime. Elder Ilubuagans still recalled that in 1939, Blas Villamor, who was supposed supposed to be popularly known as a son of a prominent Ilocano family of Bangged, went to Lubuagan and paid a sentimental visit to Matuon, his birthplace. By the time the Filipino Republic was established at Malolos, a provincial government had been instituted in Abra through the leadership of Blas Villamor with Leocadio Valera as civil governor. When the Filipino Congress was inaugurated, Abra was represented by Isidro Paredes and Juan Villamor, Blas' elder cousin, while Ignacio Villamor, Blas' elder brother, represented Ilocos Sur. When the Filipinos also set up the judiciary of government for each province, Ignacio served for Ilocos Sur. The Congress clustered Isabela, Bontoc, and Lubuagan under one Justice of Peace. It is just coherent to think that the Filipino West made a visit to Lubuagan informing the inhabitants of his appointment. That is why in Hakalanjaiyawi, the term uukom was used to refer to Emilio Aguinaldo, his staff, and the military officers who accompanied him. With Abreños with Lubuagan roots occupying high posts in the government and army of the Filipino Republic, the Ilobuagans accepted President Emilio Aguinaldo wholeheartedly when he sought temporary abode in Lubuagan, as they learned soon enough that he was a comrade of their bugat or relatives. A friend of Dr. Santiago Barcelona, Major Juan Villamor happened to be one of Tino's most energetic guerrilla commanders during the war, who distracted the U.S. Army to prevent them from cornering Aguinaldo in Lubuagan. Elder Ilubuagans also remember that in 1964, then former Senator Quintin Paredes made a sentimental visit to Sitio Matuon, which he claimed as the origin of his ancestors. Still a boy in his teens in 1900, Tintin served as interpreter for the American expedition from Abra, which was tasked to capture Aguinaldo in Lubuagan. Commandant Villamor, the Tingian chieftain of Balbalasang named Puyaw, and interpreter Paredes did much to frustrate the manhunt. With the connivance of the three, the American troops were deceived by and entertained through a pialos or welcome feast when they arrived at Balbalasang town, thereby preventing the enemy from accomplishing their mission. Now let us talk about Ilubuagan culture in 1900. In order to understand how the Ilubuagans received and responded to President Emilio Aguinaldo's appeals for cooperation and support, it is important to study the beliefs behind the custom of hospitality of the indigenous peoples of Lubuagan back then. Ilubuagan elders unfold that the Ilubuagans of yore believe in Yongyong who watches over the daily activities of humans. Alat si Yongyong on mani isjong as the admonition goes, and rewards people for their good deeds by material blessings that they will enjoy while advancing towards old age. They also feared God whom they believe gets offended when they commit evil acts and punishes them by sending sickness, famine, death, and other forms of disasters or misfortunes. They gave serious considerations to these punishments and rewards which they believe would take effect in their lifetime. These beliefs constituted the basis of their ethical behavior. And the terms paniyaw, ngilin, and biin all embrace the socio-cultural values of the Ilubuagans. Paniyaw encompasses despicable acts which are offensive to God and to fellow humans. Ngilin is the strict adherence to taboos and compliance with certain rituals to protect oneself and the family from illness and harm. And biin means courteous behavior and self-respect. Elder Ilubuagans remember that the past generations of Ilubuagans believed that those who were kind, those who lent a hand to those in need, protected and sheltered strangers, and showed hospitality and generosity to other people were rewarded by God with a long, prosperous, and happy life. And one of the acts which they considered as paniyaw or terribly wicked in the eyes of God and humankind was killing a stranger in the village where he has been given food to eat or water to drink or denying protection to a person who seeks shelter. The punishment believed to be inflicted by God for this evil act was largely in the form of successive deaths in the family. The said punishment was also regarded to be transmitted to the culprit's descendants of distant future generations who shall be made to suffer constant misfortunes until the family gets extinct or mauya chitago. Elder Ilubuagans also explained that the tribe is responsible for keeping the sanctity of its land, bogis or territory. It is paniyaw to shed the blood of a visitor or a stranger who comes in peace because it would defile the tribe's territory. If land is lajimok or defiled, no plant will grow. This is not literally understood, however. The Ilubuagans held that plants that grow on defiled soil are dirty and should not be eaten. The people involved will not increase too. In short, God's chastisement for this act was extensive. The president and his troops entered Lubuagan while being pursued by an enemy, a man from Lubo, who rushed to Lubuagan to deliver the news of the presence of American soldiers in his village, which startled Aguinaldo and his men, confirmed that they were really being pursued. Realizing that the guests were seeking abode in Lubuagan, the papangat or chieftains of the tribe decided to protect their visitors and allowed them to stay indefinitely in town. Since Aguinaldo and his party were in a situation seeking chugong, shelter or protection, the tribe's people would not allow harm to come to them. It would be paniyaw and the Ilubuagans would be cursed to extinction and their territory would be defiled. Safeguarding and sheltering strangers or guests were therefore the basis of Ilubuagan hospitality. It is the duty of the mamangili, host, or umili, citizen of an ili, to protect the mangili, stranger, visitor, or guest. So much so that it is the moral obligation of the homeowner to provide chugong to a person who seeks refuge in the former's home. And when a person who sought refuge in a house got killed, the homeowner's whole family was believed to die one after the other. Hence, Aguinaldo and his men were not only received by the Lubuagans as mangili but also sheltered by the latter under the condition called manjugong, or asylum seeker. That the Ilubwagans wanted Aguinaldo and his men to leave Lubwagan, as Billy and Carrasco claimed, became all the more out of the question since the host clans had learned that their Mangili were being hunted down by their latter's enemy. Their beliefs behind their hospitable traits constrained them against driving their visitors out in that kind of predicament. The Papangat of Lubwagan certainly discussed what to do or how to treat the visitors, and they decided that the Bangili were seeking asylum in town. Enlightened by their beliefs behind their customs and following the decision of their tribal political leaders, the people of Lubwagan sheltered the Mangili. In addition, the chieftains of Lubwagan would have thought that their success in sheltering a large number of guests would surely bring honor to them at home and would ensure respect in other towns which they had abujong. Moreover, as the house is the area of jurisdiction of the homeowner, it is the territory of a tribe. Under the bujong system, the responsibility of the tribe. The tribe is responsible for the security of anyone who enters it in peace. President Aguinaldo and his troops entered the territories of the tribes of the Tanudan River Valley in peace, so they were secured. Aguinaldo and his band therefore benefited from the Budong institution of the Kalingas because through it the allied villages took turns in preserving them. The Mangili were covered by the security catered by these villages by virtue of existing bujong between them. Because of the culture of bujong, Aguinaldo and his men were always guided and escorted in the villages until they were endorsed by the hosts to the next village. The men who assisted Aguinaldo and those who accompanied his party as trailblazers and guides did the work voluntarily without expecting payment, as it was considered as their expression of wholeheartedness. The Mangili were therefore well fed, entertained, and convoyed by the allied villages which they passed through on their way to Lubwagan and later as the party evacuated the town. And as visitors of the Lubwagan tribe, Aguinaldo and his troops were also entitled to the protection of the neighboring tribes with which the Ilubwagans had abujong. Now, according to Hakalan Jayawi, Aguinaldo and his troops did not go straight to the town when they entered Lubwagan territory. Instead, they occupied the high ground at Kokojong, located to the west and above Lubwagan, where they pitched camp for 2 days, having confidence in their strength as an ili, as their men outnumbered the force of Aguinaldo and informed beforehand of the arrival and intention of the Filipino troops from their allied neighbors where Aguinaldo's party had been. The Ilubwagans just waited for the visitor to approach them. What could have made the Ilubwagans of 1900 feel secure at that time, according to Ilubwagan elders at present, was their faith in the power of Tobe. The people of Lubwagan of the bygone generations had held the belief that whenever there were enemy raids, especially those which originated from the south, the guardian spirit Tobe would always come to the rescue. Tobe uh, would appear as a huge ball of fire, flying up and down, back and forth from atop Mount Peking down the Kayakayam River, usually over the Sayang Meusong Creek. When there were adversaries, sometimes it would come as a strong wind, as if felling branches of trees, a typhoon or heavy rain at midday, with the sun shining even out of seasons. At times it would appear as a very thick and dark cloud, enveloping the whole town and causing zero visibility. Tobe could kill would-be attackers, but more often only terrifies them with its awful apparitions and roars of fury, scaring them and driving them back across Lubwagan's border. It could also transform a harmless carabao into a beast with an unrestrained zeal, attacking hostile warriors in defense of those of Lubwagan. And since Aguinaldo and his men had succeeded in reaching Bialalaw Ridge, even climbing up to Kokojong on top of Mount Peking, which is believed to be the abode of Tobe, the people would have been assured that the guardian spirit that, that watches over Lubwagan seemed to have welcomed Aguinaldo and his contingent. It was Patungaw of the Igaang clan of Lubwagan who brought President Emilio Aguinaldo and his soldiers down the settlement. No one knows who approached who, but what is certain is that Patunga was then working in his Uma or Sweden at Magangay, an area of the mountain slope just below Kokpojong, as the season of Liegero, corresponding to the month of March, was traditionally the start of clearing the Sweden farms in Lubwagan. In 1900, Patungaw and Amay's family was living in Sichuti Wood. Their octagonal dwelling used to be found at the place where the Early Childhood Care and Development Center stands. Patungaw and Amay's Beyoy or Gilitub was built of cheap uh, carved and cut hardwood planks and wall boards that became President Emilio Aguinaldo's home while seeking asylum in town. And based on the drawings and cross-section of Aguinaldo's encampment captured by the American soldiers, Patungaw and Amay's Beoy was modified to serve as President's Palacio or Presidencia in Lubuagan. We can also learn from this document that 20 dwellings housed Aguinaldo's officers and 150 were offered to the soldiers. Since the Papangat resolved to provide shelter to Aguinaldo and his soldiers, Ilubuagan hospitality soon came to be a collective initiative of the whole tribe. The Papangat surely took turns in welcoming Aguinaldo and his soldiers by giving them a pialos, not only as a ritual feast in receiving a guest, but also as a customary gesture of their deference, showing high regard for the President of the Filipino government. Rendering a pialos as a social courtesy to a town's guest was part of their obligations as tribal political leaders. By giving Aguiledio a pialos, the Papangat and prominent men of Lubuagan in 1900 acknowledged his status as political leader of the Filipino government. And by playing their gangsa or gongs and dancing malachok or tadok during Aguinaldo's birthday party, the Ilubuagans attributed notions of preeminence to the president's celebration. Now, the naming of children and grandchildren by the Ilobuagans after Aguinaldo and some of his men is a unique source of direct evidence of the good fellowship that prospered between the Mangili and the Umili in 1900, and most importantly, that Aguinaldo's sojourn in town was a significant event for the Ilobuagans. This is a partial list of names of Ilobuagans who were born after Aguinaldo's sojourn in town, whose parents and grandparents had in one way or another developed friendly relations with Aguinaldo and his men. The Ilobuagans of bygone generations used to name their progenies after those of their ancestors to perpetuate their memory. The Ilobuagans also had a preference to name their male children and grandchildren after the papangat of their clan in the hope that the young would emulate their good deeds or heroic feats. The custom of naming offsprings after non-relative, non-Kalinga visitors who were silulod or befriended by the Lubuagans seems to have begun since Aguinaldo's abode in town. Biangyagan, also known as Ayato, piggybacked the president from the Awijon Plateau back to Lubuagan, a distance of around 6 kilometers of going uphill and downhill along narrow paths. Biangyagan of Ipakak Igyaan clans was a young adult living with his maternal uncle at Sitio Tabiangao when Aguiledio became his family's guest. The firstborn son of Amay, with her first husband Ayangchu, Ayato obligingly assisted his family in providing for the needs of their guests, like guiding them in their reconnaissance trip to Awijon. He administered first aid to Aguinaldo when the latter suddenly became afflicted with skin allergy by applying heated leaves of the Bellata tree on the infected portions of the president's body. Biangyagan's presence of mind and knowledge of the herbal medicine practically helped save Aguinaldo's life. With his neck becoming swelled due to allergy, the president would have been choked to death. Now, the place names Manila, Cavite, Bantay, and Tagaytay that is stuck in Lubuagan since Aguinaldo's sojourn in town exist to this day. Originally used as codes to identify the locations and fortifications built by Aguiledio and his men, the Ilubuagan knowledge of these place names, which is preserved orally and handed down to the next generations, is a testament to Ilubuagan active involvement in the Filipino cause. Ilobuagan Hospitality almost provided all the logistic support Aguinaldo and his men needed, such as food supplies, lodging, building materials, and even medicine and labor force. As was already mentioned, a horse trail was even built across the Uma villages at the request of Aguinaldo through the old custom of giving voluntary, free, and cooperative manual labor called tukon, which is a viable practice among the Ilobuagans to this day. This trail was later used by Aguinaldo and his party when they evacuated Lubuagan. Traces of this trail can still be seen up to present in barangays Western Uma. Aguinaldo organized some men into a sort of sandatahan or men armed with bladed weapons, serving as informers or scouts and sentinels. The existence of a Fuerza Franca de Servicio or volunteer troops made of local tribesmen is another proof of the Lubuagan active involvement in Aguinaldo's military operations. Despite the absence of experience of Spanish colonial rule and shown with benevolence and deferential attention by Aguinaldo and his men, the Ilobuagans reacted positively to President Aguinaldo's appeal for cooperation and unity, an exemplary manifestation of their willingness to take part in the ambitious project of building a nation while in the midst of a war against foreign aggression. Disposed to seek adventure and glory in battle, some of the men showed ardor to join the troops serving the equally risky roles. Apprehensive of the peril of being killed, they volunteered still. The Ilobuagans and their Kabujong or allied neighbors, which Aguinaldo and his men had organized to serve as sentinels, scouts, and runners, were so efficient in being reliable and in being swift in bringing in information, and were so supportive of the Filipino force to the extent that even though Aguilejo had evacuated the town, and while his party was in Asibanglan already, which was 2 days' travel on foot away, somebody from Lobwagen still went dutifully reporting to Aguinaldo about the enemy and the fate of their comrades. The development of national consciousness among Ilugwagans, who were never vanquished by others, only began when the Filipino government forces, led by the president himself, retreated to Lubwagan and made the town his headquarters, gradually and carefully orienting the local tribesmen of their civic duties germane to the cause of independence and practically integrating them into the Filipino nation at war. Let me end by stating that foregrounding Hakalanjaewi aims to recognize and include in the narrative of Philippine history the role of the Ilubuagans in the story President Aguinaldo's retreat in Lubuagan, which is missing in the text of the NHCP historical marker found in town and which is not easily apparent in the diaries of Aguinaldo's companions. It also intends to accentuate the beneficent and admirable beliefs behind practices of the Ilubuagans. The kind-hearted and hospitable character of the people can be brilliantly perceived by studying the beliefs that confers wisdom about their customs. Aguinaldo's temporary refuge in Lubuagan affirmed the Ilubuagan belief of Tobe, the guardian spirit that had protected the town from harmful attacks by local enemies, foreign invaders, and even by epidemic diseases. Aguilejo had no disposition to do harm to the people of Lubuagan, so Tobe allowed him to enter and stay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Professor Ligero. We we might extend a bit. I would like to beg the indulgence of our attendees so that we can watch the final presentation of our final presenter, Dr. Galang. We might extend a bit beyond 12, probably 12:15 to give time for our Q&A. Now, let us watch the final presentation to be presented by Dr. Galang. Dr. Galang's paper is entitled Chinese Miners in Lepanto, 1856 to 1898. Dr. Jelly A. Galang is an assistant professor of history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He holds a PhD Asian Studies degree from Murdoch University. He received his BA degree and MA History degrees from UP. He finishes BA, by the way, with honors cum laude. In 2011, the National Commission for Culture and the Arts awarded him the Young Historians Prize. He is a member of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies and the Asian Studies Association of Australia. He is currently the Deputy Director of the Third World Studies Center. He is now doing research on Chinese miners in the 18th century Philippines. Let us all watch the presentation that Dr. Galang has prepared for us this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Naimbag nga bigat kadakli amin. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for listening to our panel. Today, I'll be presenting my paper, Chinese Miners in Ripanto, 1856 to 1898. The longer and abridged version of this paper has been published in the most recent issue of the journal Southeast Asian Studies of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Kyoto University. I wish to thank the editorial board of this journal, as well as the organizing committee of the Third International Conference in Cordillera Studies for allowing me to share some salient points of this research with you. This paper presents a narrative on the lives of Chinese laborers in the copper mines of Lipanto, now Benguet, from 1856 to 1898, while Ilocanos, Igorots, and Tingians were also employed by the Spanish company Sociedad Minero Metalúrgica Cantabro Filipina de Mancayan, or Cantabro Filipina Company, which was considered the most successful of all mining speculations undertaken on a large scale in the colony. Chinese laborers were preferred when it came to opening up large areas in this mineral belt of Luzon. This preference was due to the Chinese workers' mining skills and the availability of inexpensive Chinese labor. The hazardous nature of mining and the Spaniards' negative stereotypical view of Chinese as dangerous, albeit necessary outsiders, also made the Chinese the most suitable labor force for mining. The shocking conditions in the mines and the abuses committed against the Chinese laborers caused many workers to run away. This map shows the political and military district of Lepanto in northern Luzon, its capital Kayan, surrounding villages, and the sites of the major copper mines where Chinese laborers were employed during the second half of the 19th century. From the outset of Spanish rule, reports from the colony were sent to Spain detailing the types of resources to be obtained and their locations in the islands. The Spaniards soon learned that Filipinos had some knowledge of mining, but the amount they produced was small compared to what they could actually be obtained. Notwithstanding this observation, some Spanish officials to improve the miserable state of mining in the Philippines, the colony in the 16th and 17th centuries continued to depend on metal imports from China. It was only in the 18th century that serious initiatives were undertaken to open up the Philippines mining frontier when some Spanish industrialists initiated the exploration and extraction of minerals in several mountainous regions of Luzon and Visayas. Chinese skilled and unskilled laborers were absolutely crucial in the working of all these iron mines. The preference for Chinese labor was due to their knowledge and skill in smelting and smithing. For the colonial authorities, the Chinese laborers' work ethic was commendable. These qualities of the Chinese led Spanish industrialists to import labor directly from China. When occasional disruptions in the importation of Chinese labor occurred, Spanish businessmen resorted to obtaining mine laborers from Parian, the Chinese enclave in Manila, especially before the last Chinese expulsion in 1766. Despite their skills and work ethic, however, Chinese laborers were treated as a marginal group. By virtue of their ethnic origins and their socioeconomic status, they were situated at the bottom of the colonial social structure. In this case, in the mid-18th century, they could be compelled to work for whatever purpose their colonial masters deemed suitable. They had to work incessantly for long hours in order to obtain the amount of iron the Spanish capitalists expected. The strenuous nature of mine work required sufficient food intake, but only a limited supply of food was provided for them. As in the earlier period, Chinese laborers were also employed in the copper mines of Lipanto in the 19th century. Copper in the mountainous frontier of northern Luzon was first mentioned in the 1770s. However, no attempt was made to tap its potential until Governor Pascual Enrile in the 1830s tried to curb the circulation of counterfeit money called sipping by instructing Colonel Guillermo Galvi to tackle the problem and to also be on the lookout for copper deposits. However, this specific directives for exploring the mineral resources of the mountains between Cagayan and Ilocos were issued only in 1834. In 1835, assisted by Jose Maria Peñaranda, Galvez undertook the search for copper in Gambang, Lamagang, Ampan, and Apayao. These settlements were part of the 60 tributary villages or rancherias under the political and military district of Lipanto. Galvi and Peñaranda not only discovered a copper region of unquestioned value, they also learned that the Igorot of these rancherias had been mining copper even before the Spanish colonization of the islands. The mining engineer Antonio Hernandez, who was sent to the Cordilleras in 1850, learned how the Igorots mined and smelted ores. However, from the standpoint of the Spaniards, the Igorots' quote-unquote rudimentary mining and smelting techniques produced low-quality ore. This deplorable situation could be improved with the help of mining experts. In 1837, the Inspección General de Minas, or Bureau of Mines, was established to promote the mining industry. It was through the efforts of the Bureau's Corps of Engineers that systematic studies on the copper mines in Lepanto were undertaken. Proposals for the systematic exploitation of the Lepanto mines were submitted to Manila 2 years after the Hernandez 1850 expedition. On September 5, 1852, Antonio Pereira, the military commandant of Cayenne, the capital of Lepanto, made a proposal to exploit the mines in Mangkayan. In 1854, the project was approved and operations began immediately. However, the lack of Igorot laborers willing to stay for long periods of time in the mines and the lack of additional funds required brought the state-sponsored operations to a halt. It was then that the Cantabro Filipino Company stepped in, obtained the mine claims, and continued the work that the colonial government had started. The Cantabro Filipino Company began its operation in March 1856 after Venancio Balbas was allowed to explore the Santa Barbara mine in Magamban, Mangkayan. Despite Balbas's efforts, no copper was produced in the early years of operations. In order to find out what was wrong, a special commission led by Jose Maria Santos, chief engineer of the Bureau of Mines, was sent to Lipanto in October 1859. In November 1861, Santos submitted his report, which contained, among other things, important recommendations for salvaging the future of the mines. One of these recommendations was to create a well-structured administration to preside over every aspect of mining operations. To the capable leadership of Santos, copper production in the 10 mines of Lipanto gradually increased after 1862 until the peak year of 1870. Table 1 depicts the annual copper production of the Cantabro Filipino Company in the decade between 1864 and 1874. According to Santos, it was advantageous to hire Chinese laborers as they proved to be knowledgeable and worked well. The Chinese miners were instrumental in improving the, quote, imperfect and inefficient means employed by the savages, unquote. These young and able-bodied men also consistently augmented the small number of Igorots who wanted to be employed in the mine works. In July 1856, preparatory work at the Lipanto mines began with the arrival of 120 contracted Chinese laborers. 10 months later, another 156 Chinese arrived in the mines. In 1861, the mines had only 140 Chinese laborers. This number had increased to more than 600 by 1869 and then dropped to 400 by 1870. During the 1875-76 registration, there were only 87 Chinese registered in Lepanto. The number of Chinese laborers was dependent upon fluctuations in the price of ore and the amounts of copper produced, the lack of Filipino laborers from the area, and the amount of work required. For example, in 1870-71, when copper production was high, as you can see on the slide, an additional 91 Chinese laborers were contracted to work in the mines. The recruitment of Chinese labor for the Lipanto mines followed the general pattern of the global coolie traffic during the second half of the 19th century. Under the auspices of the coolie agency system, young men from South China were signed up for manual work overseas by unscrupulous agents or brokers. Chinese laborers would then be held in barracks while waiting for foreign agents to negotiate their contracts. Chinese laborers sent to work the Lipanto mines were transported to the Philippines with batches of other Chinese bound for plantation work in Cuba, Peru, and other colonies in Spanish America. It was also possible for campus agents to negotiate with Chinese or Chinese mestizo cabecillas or employers in Manila instead of going directly to China. However, if a cabecilla had only a limited number of laborers, the agent would seek help from the Gobernadorcillo de San Luis, the highest representative of the Chinese community in Manila. The latter could provide additional labor from among newly arrived migrants who did not have a cabecilla to take them in, who were temporarily lodged at the Casa Tribunal de San Luis in Binondo. The length of service and salary of laborers is specified in the contract were negotiated between the company agent and the brokers in China or the cabecillas in Manila. Chinese laborers for the Ripanto mines were issued contracts before their embarkation from Macau or Amoy. The length of service was normally between 1 and 2 years, which could be renewed based on the company's need and laborers' performance. The laborer's salary was determined by the company. The laborer's entire salary for the first year of employment was transferred by the company agent to the broker or the cabecilla, who would deduct all debts incurred by the laborer before going to the mines. Mine work was generally determined by the locations where the Chinese laborers had to work. Exterior work referred to activities outside the tunnels. During the early months of opening up an area for mining, Chinese laborers had to clear the forest to make the area habitable. After this initial phase, the Chinese had to build and maintain a number of structures. They also had to construct their own barracks within the confines of the mining compound. As the Chinese were hired primarily for the actual mining or related underground works from 1856 until the end of the company's full-scale operations in 1875. Chinese workers chiseled away at the ore face. They also drilled holes and set explosive charges to dislodge the ore. They would then bring the ore to the tunnel entrances. Igorot women would mill and wash the ore before their men sorted and classified it. In the 1880s, 15 to 20 Igorot women and some Chinese were usually employed to classify the ores. During the 19th century, Kongsi associations were important in settling and developing many mining frontiers in Southeast Asia. The Kongsi, a form of open government based on an enlarged partnership, aimed to protect the rights of their members and promote their economic productivity and resist outside powers that would abuse them. Kongsis, however, did not develop in the Philippines. Hence, the management of Chinese labor in the Panto mines was in the hands of the company's Spanish administrators and Ilocano workers. Table 2 lists the personnel employed in the Lipanto copper mines in 1861. Chinese laborers worked in shifts, as mine labor, particularly in the foundries, had to be done around the clock. The copper mine zone was divided into two areas. The major mine site was located in Mangkayan, and minor ones were in the area of Suyok, Bumukon, Lupaak, and Agbao. During the rainy season, additional hands were deployed at the Suyok mines as the neighboring Igorots of Suyok had to tend their crops. Each group of laborers was supervised by a Spanish watchman during the day and two Filipino foremen at night. Both the laborers and foremen were under the supervision of a Spanish chief foreman. A typical workday for laborers would start before daybreak with breakfast, mainly rice or root crops, a piece of meat, and vegetables prepared in their assigned quarters. After breakfast, Chinese laborers lined up in front of the administration office. There, the foreman counted them, making note of any laborers who were sick or had absconded. Those who were ill were sent to the infirmary, where they were attended to by a surgical practitioner and given medicine. For minor accidents, first aid kits were readily available. Those with more serious ailments and injuries were brought to either of the two infirmaries in Mangkayan or Kayan. However, if a sick person was found unfit for work, he would be sent back to Manila and a replacement would be sought at the company's expense. On the other hand, laborers who fled were pursued by Igorot warriors assigned to capture these defiant absconders. The heaviest, most physically demanding, and most dangerous work was assigned to non-Christian Chinese, Igorots, and Tinggians, who also received the lowest salaries among the company's personnel. Commenting on their low salaries, Santos stated in 1861, quote, "I do not think there is an establishment of the same kind with such modest wages," unquote. The laborers bought their food and other supplies from the company store, which was maintained by the warehouse keeper. The food allowance was provided by the company, but the laborers' other living expenses had to come from their salaries. Chinese laborers were encouraged to buy supplies and staples from the company store on credit. By comparison, a Spanish watchman received 140 pesos annually, while a Christian Indio foreman received 96 pesos, which is more than double the salary of a Chinese or Igorot laborer. This difference in wages suggests that the company took religious affiliations and racial identities into consideration when hiring employees. The crucial skills needed to operate the mines were absolutely important, but the Spanish employees, who were at the top of the labor ladder, were not always as qualified as they were expected to be for mine work. There were engineers who were hired despite their lack of training and experience. Chinese laborers built their own barracks adjacent to the mining area. They were not allowed to go outside their compound. Furthermore, two Spanish watchmen were specifically assigned to ensure that no Chinese violated the rule of remaining within their compound. Only those individuals who were sick and no longer capable of working were allowed to return to Manila. Chinese laborers worked 25 days a month. The only break in their annual work routine was the celebration of Chinese New Year. Sundays were reserved for religious observance of the Christian employees and were deemed an opportune time to proselytize among the heathen, quote-unquote, Chinese Igorots and Tinggian laborers. The 1867 mining decree stipulated that when a mining site employed more than 250 families, a chaplain should be appointed in the area. As early as 1861, the government had requested an Augustinian missionary for the mines, but it was only in October 1874 that the Augustinian friar Marcelino Ceballos arrived on site. He stayed for just a few months. It was only in the late 1880s that the mission of Mangkayan was established and permanently administered by the Agustinos Calzados. Sundays were also set aside for leisure activities, but since the Chinese laborers were confined to their compound, they were content to gamble and play cards and games of chance. They also drank basi, especially on occasions like Chinese New Year. They also smoked in order to cope with the cold and mountainous areas. Tobacco was readily available either through the contraband trade of the Igorots or supplied by the company. But it was opium that these laborers craved. Mine work was physically demanding, dangerous, and unhealthy. Chinese laborers had to utilize their brute strength to clear large tracts of forest in order for mining operations to be established. They had to cut down sturdy trees with axes and hand saws. In the process, they were exposed to the perennial problem of hostile attacks by groups of the Cordilleras, who were described by Santos in stereotypical terms as, quote, primitive, savages, and cruel. Early Spanish explorers and later the owners and administrators of the Cantabria Filipino Company were aware of the headhunting expeditions of the Igorots, particularly the Ifugaos between the 1830s and 1850s. Inside the tunnels, Chinese laborers were also exposed to great dangers, inhaling air lacking oxygen and filled with metallic and non-metallic dust. Acrid smoke from candles or torches used inside the tunnels, as well as smoke from gunpowder used in blasting operations, added to the air pollution that affected the health of Chinese laborers. Mine cave-ins caused by earthquakes and the use of explosives regularly threatened the workers' safety. Strong earthquakes occurred in Luzon in 1855 and again in 1866. The violent and destructive earthquake of July 1880 hit Lipanto and Abra, leaving a trail of destruction. There were also deadly diseases that threatened the laborers, such as malaria and smallpox. For most Filipinos, the uplands were an avoidable place, as the forests were considered to be full of fever, which was the main symptom of malaria. The fevers normally became rampant after the rains and in woody or marshy areas. Difficult workplace conditions were partly the reason why Chinese laborers were hired by the Cantabria Filipino Company in the first place. While it was clear that the Chinese laborers were preferred for their skills, work ethic, and relatively low wages, they were still relegated to the lowest strata of the labor hierarchy in the mines. Coercion and abuses were committed against them. The 1867 mining decree, for example, stated that the Chinese were to be hired to work in unpopulated and unhealthy areas of the Philippines in order to develop the country's mining industry. Local inhabitants could be hired, but only those who were living within the boundaries of the prospective mining area, as they were familiar with the site and had already adapted to local climatic conditions. Ironically, the Chinese, who did the most physically taxing and dangerous mine work, still had to adjust to their new environment with all its geophysical and epidemic disease-related threats. Abuses against Chinese workers were not noted even in the Bureau of Mines reports in the early 1860s. Little attention or regard was paid to the well-being of the Chinese laborers. Furthermore, the geographic distance between Lipanto and the capital, Manila, and the inaccessibility of the mines presented serious obstacles to the central colonial government to act against unfavorable conditions. Because of the hard labor conditions that they had to endure, some Chinese miners resorted to absconding. Those who had spent an adequate period of time in the mines and gained some local knowledge of the area tended to form groups and escape. Individuals who managed to evade the police forces would flee to the towns of Ilocos and La Union. However, when the German traveler Karl Semper made a trip to the mines in 1861, he learned that escapes did not always have a happy ending. He said, "Some subject Igorots brought one of these unfortunate chaps," meaning runaway Chinese laborers, "back the other day. He had to till the soil under some unconquered Igorots for several months. They had taken all his clothes and cut his hair according to their style. This had changed his appearance, so much that I could only recognize him as Chinese after a close look." Captured Chinese laborers were subjected to disciplinary measures, such as cultivating local farms for months without any recompense. The cutting of hair as a degrading punishment is also worth noting, as hair, especially in Chinese culture and tradition, has social and personal significance. Generally, for the Chinese, maintaining their hair in Q style was an important physical sign of their belonging to the Celestial Empire. For a Chinese fugitive whose hair was cut, the punishment did not only alter his appearance, but also resulted in an extreme form of moral humiliation. Strict and unjust treatment compelled some more robust Chinese to challenge or disobey mine authorities, both Spanish and Filipino, who supervised their lives and work. This resistance was the main reason why Santos in 1862 recommended that Chinese labor, especially those assigned to use explosives in the mines, be supervised in, quote, brusquely, in imperious ways, unquote, as they pose a serious danger to the mines and the other workers. Abuses were so widespread in the mines where Chinese labor was used that the 1867 mine decree specifically ordered the provincial governor to conduct visits to the mines. Copper production began to decline in 1871. There were two possible reasons for this unfortunate event. The first had to do with the increase in copper production in other parts of the world, which affected the demand for Philippine copper, extracted mainly in Ripanto. The discovered exploitation of copper mines in Great Britain in the late 1850s contributed to the increase in world copper production. The second reason was that in 1871, the anti-Chinese Governor General Izquierdo began his tenure in the Philippines. It was during his term that new restrictive policies on Chinese occupations and residence patterns were implemented. These measures affected the recruitment and deployment of Chinese miners to Lipanto. In 1875, the Cantabria Filipino Company withdrew from the Lipanto mines, leaving them in the hands of a few Spaniards, who continued small-scale mining operations until the American occupations of the islands. These Spaniards were original shareholders of the company, assisted by some Igorot and Chinese miners continued to procure small amounts of copper. Some Chinese continued to work in the mines. Together with Igorots, they engaged in smithing and minting of counterfeit shipping. Many Chinese who had been in the area for a long time married Igorot women who had helped them in their small-scale mining. With their Igorot wives, some Chinese laborers also opened retail businesses, while one even ventured into planting coffee in the area. In conclusion, we can say that Chinese miners were crucial to the development of the Philippine mining industry in the 18th and 19th centuries. In particular, Chinese labor hired by the Cantabria Filipino Company for its copper mines in the Panto between 1856 and 1898 were essential in all types of mine-related activities. Their technical and manual skills and work ethic were the reasons the company employed them. However, the marginality of the Chinese miners must also be noted, especially within the context of the prevailing colonial policy and practices, as well as the difficult conditions in the mines. These adverse conditions and circumstances provided opportunities for both Spanish and native employees of the company to abuse Chinese miners, who were able to take advantage of the legal mechanisms established by the colonial government for their protection. Their lack of effective representation in the mines administration prevented Chinese laborers from reporting their unjust treatment to the authorities. It is thus not surprising that flight was common among Chinese laborers. However, there were also some miners who, because of their long residence in the area and their local knowledge, were able to assimilate with the local population. These men married Igorot women and put down roots in Lipanto and neighboring areas. Maraming salamat.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jelly Galang, for that presentation. Okay, so in summary, allow me to summarize both papers. So Professor Ligero's paper presented lesser-known developments in the history of the Philippine Revolution. The study of the revolution has always been limited to events that have taken place at Manila and its surrounding environs. Through Professor Ligero's paper, we can examine how the revolution has in fact spread outward and has influenced other regions outside of the primate city and its immediate environs such as Cavite and other areas, Bulacan, and how the Cordillerans have in fact played a role in such national events. As for Dr. Galang's paper, he intimated with us a different perspective on the mining industry in the Philippines, particularly in the Cordilleras. When we study the mining industry in the Cordillera region, most historical researchers focus on the gold industry of the Cordilleras, and rightfully so. Given that gold has primarily been the main mineral mined in the region historically. This does not mean, however, that no other mineral resource has been mined in the region. Dr. Galang's paper has been able to bring into the forefront the study of a key mineral often neglected in such literatures, copper, and not to mention that his study focuses on other ethnic groups that have been heavily interwoven with the history of the Cordilleras, particularly the ethnic Chinese. So with those papers presented, we are now opening the floor to questions from our participants. There have already been two questions posted earlier for the paper of Professors Arellano and Professor Pawilet. The first question was actually posted by Dr. Florendo. Her question was, does your survey capture the rancherias, settlements along the foothills of the Cordillera? Examples are the orders of Candon, Tagudin, etc.
Yan, magandang umaga po, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I think na-capture naman yung mga rancherias. Although, the thing with, for example, ma'am, taga Canton ako, tapos Canton yung papers. Hindi kasi kompleto yung details ng pagkakayos. Ang nabanggit lang na rancheria doon, for example, sa Ilocos Sur, ay yung Burgos. Aside from that, ma'am, mayroon pang isa sa Ilocos Norte, but the rest, ma'am, ay hindi kasi nababanggit yung rancheria. Pero kung titingnan yung paano, yung conceptualization natin ng rancheria, marami doon ay nako-cover din ng mapa, ma'am.
Would you like to add to that, Sir Bernie?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Florendo. Actually, yun na rin po yung nasabi ni Sir Ryan regarding those sa rancherias. Hindi siya na-mention masyado except for Burgos and one in Ilocos Norte. However, nakikita naman din natin siguro yung pagkilos na nangyari. Yun nga lang kasi si HDP, Historical Data Papers, ay hindi niya na-mention yung part na yon ng rancheria except for that particular rancheria of Burgos. So, yun lang ang Even nung minamapa natin ito, nung we're in the process of mapping it, walang lumalabas na rancheria sa sa pagmamapa nito. So, yun po.
Okay, thank you, Professor Arellano. Now, a second question was actually posted in the chat box by Dr. Galang. In fact, I also have my question is actually quite similar to Dr. Galang's. He was wondering if there are studies made after the 1950s that would corroborate the information that you mined from the historical data papers as well as the findings you presented. In fact, if I am to hitchhike my question with that of Dr. Galang's, this is because there have been historical data papers produced after the 1950s. In fact, there is one here by during the Marcos administration, 1969 to 1970s, that in fact have information on the Cordilleras. So the first part, in fact, of the book already goes straight to the province of Abra. So why, I think that's a question maybe, why did you just specify the use of the 1950s historical data paper? Why have you not gone beyond that and used the other historical data papers to corroborate your findings? So that one for Professors
Sir Bernie.
Arellano and Pawilet.
so,
Thank you.
Sir
Akala ko
Ryan,
si
ikaw
Sir Bernie.
muna.
Ayun sir. Una-una sir, bakit namin pinili yung 1950s? Well, because of the limitations nga ng ating current setup. So yun yung available sa amin na data. Second, um, siguro in my opinion, parang hindi masyadong nagagamit yung paper na yon at pwede siyang i-process pa to be part of a paper presentation or article para ilapat kumbaga sa mga nagawa ng current studies tulad nung kay yung 1960s or yung kay Marcos. Other studies, I don't know kung merong study na tulad din ng pagmamapa. So si Sir Bernie siguro yung makakasagot niyan dahil galing siya na NCCA, tama?
Dati
Yun.
yun.
But other studies that can corroborate that kung hindi man directly through mapping ay yung kay Kissing, 1962. Discovery of the Igorots by William Henry Scott, 1970s. Tapos meron din po tayong available sa internet, although for some reason from DOA siya, no? Yung list of identified ancestral domains. Yun, meron po silang listahan at pwede natin makita yung pangalan ng tao, yung place, at saka yung ano yung group, indigenous group niya. So far, doon sa listahan, kahit konti lang yung list of identified ancestral domains, marami talaga doon sa Ilocos Sur ang Tinggian. Tapos pagbaba na ng La Union, Pangasinan na areas, yun na yung Kankanay at saka Ibaloy. Yun yung nakalista doon sa ancestral domains. Tapos ang NCIP kasi, meron din naman sila kaso lang ang problema namin, well, to based on past experiences with NCIP, minsan hindi kasi officially published. So pupunta ka sa office nila, may sarili silang mapa, pero hindi yung officially published kumbaga. At hindi readily available kumbaga minsan sa public yung mga maps na yan. Although meron na NCIP. Sir
Okay.
Bernie, NCA?
Yeah, i-add ko yung dun kay Felix Keesing at saka kay William Henry Scott is yung sa NCCA. Pagkakaalam ko kasi dito sa well, in the case of some towns that we have experienced with cultural mapping, they use the 1950s historical data papers as well as yung mga sinasabi nila mga kwento mula sa mga matatanda. Yun yung usually na sinasabi nila. And then another thing is that I made a study also, but this is a very particular place in Ilocos, vegan, wherein they did mention about movements coming in from Abra, coming in from different places such as other parts of Ilocos, and yun nga may nakita pa nga ako na Pampanga dun sa HTP. So yun medyo nagko-corroborate yung HTP papers din dun sa mga pinag-aralan namin. And yun nga on my research, uh, lumalabas yon yung mga mine-mention nila movements of the people. Yung akin lang though is particularly in the area within in Metro Vigan area. So I think that's one study that we can that can corroborate aside from the HDP tawag ito HDP papers. So ayun po, HDP.
Okay, thank you for that, Professors Arellano and Pawilen. For Professor Ligero, we have two questions. The first one was someone from our audience. The question was, how did Aguinaldo and the revolutionaries who went to Kalinga gain the trust of the Ilubwagans? That's the first question. Allow me to ask as well the second question for the sake of time. The second question which was raised was, how did you arrive with the conclusion that the use of oral traditions of the Lubwagan on Aguinaldo can be a credible source on his voyage to Kalinga? So those are the questions that were raised for your paper, Professor Ligero. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the questions, but I am sure that I have discussed a lot about the first question. I mentioned that number one, Aguinaldo was accepted wholeheartedly in Lubuagan because um, some of the members of the Filipino Republic had Lubuagan roots. So I mentioned the Villamors of Bangged Abra. And then Lubuagan was organized as part of the Filipino Republic. In fact, in the laws of the Malolos Republic, you can find there the town of Lubuagan as listed in the judiciary of government. So, biruin mo yon yung Lubuagan, hindi naman siya town, hindi naman siya province, pero bakit special mention siya doon sa laws of the Philippine Republic? I mentioned that in my presentation that it was clustered with Bontoc and Isabela, no? And comprise one judiciary, no? Or one under one justice of peace. So ibig sabihin talagang nasa radar ng mga ng pamahalaang Pilipino yung bayan na yan. Alam ng pamahalaan na nag-i-exist yung bayan na yan. And then of course yung hospitality ng mga Tagalubwagan ay bahagi nung kanilang paniniwala na magbibigay ng blessing yun sa kanila. And then of course yung meron din yung sistema ng bujong or bilateral agreement na kapag may bisita, obligasyon ng mga tribo na dapat protektahan mo yung stranger lalo na kapag wala namang ginawang masama. So si Aguinaldo at saka yung tropa niya, there was no memory of military abuses in Lubuagan, mabait sila. Nagustuhan ng tao yung mga sundalo. In fact, pinangalan pa nga sa mga apo, 'di ba? Pinangalan pa sa mga anak. In fact, yung plaza nila na dinevelop ng American government, hindi naman pinangalan sa kung sinong quote-unquote white apo. Bakit pinangalan kay Aguinaldo? Pwede namang Walter F. Hale Park. Bakit Emilio Aguinaldo Park yung binigay na pangalan? Diba? Samantalang, for example, si Walter Hale nagstay sa Lubuagan for almost 8 years. Pero bakit si Aguinaldo ang ginamit na pangalan para dun sa importanteng espasyo ng kanilang bayan? And then for the second question, of course, yung Hakalandya Iyawi, meron kasi akong process na ginawa para ma-ascertain yung credibility ng information. Number one is corroboration. Kasi yung mga diaries, mini-mention din nila yung mga detalles like yung mga anong araw pumunta sa Awidjon para mag-reconnaissance. So halimbawa, nabanggit yan March 14, 1900 doon sa diary ni Villa. So kaya ko ngayon na ilapat yung oral history o yung oral tradition doon sa document kasi nagtutugma yung date na ito yung date na nagpunta sila doon sa Awidjon Plateau. Ito yung date na sumakit yung tiyan ni Aguinaldo at na bigla siyang nangati at nagsuka-suka. So, although hindi binabanggit si Bianyage na siya yung nagbuhat doon sa presidente sa ganung kalayo na 6 kilometers at siya yung nagtapal ng mga kung ano-ano mga dahon-dahon doon sa katawan ng Pangulo, pero kinokorroborate kasi nung written account na binabanggit na ganun nga. In fact, kahit yung 2-day encampment nila doon sa ibabaw ng bayan, nandoon yun nasa diary yun So ibig sabihin, yung corroboration ang crucial na method para ma-ascertain na itong mga sinasabi sa Hakalandya Iyawi ay credible na information. And then, syempre, meron pa rin mga instances na hindi nagtutugma yung yung oral tradition at saka yung diary. Kasi halimbawa doon sa diary nakalagay na for example sinunog daw yung ng mga Amerikano yung bayan ng Lubuagan, pero according to the elders hindi nila sinunog. Walang memory yung mga matatanda na sinunog ng mga Amerikano yung buong bayan. Nung nag-search ako, nakita ko yung American report na actually ang sinunog lang pala ay yung mismong palasyo ni Aguinaldo. So in a way, di tama yung mga matatanda na hindi totoong sinunog nila yung buong bayan. ang sinunog lang nila yung palasyo. So kumbaga, importante yung corroboration pa rin. Pero syempre dahil local history ito, ay syempre paniniwalaan pa rin natin yung oral account. Hindi kailangang i-corroborate. Kasi yun yung history nila eh. Yun yung significant na account sa kanila. So in a way, hindi rin talaga kailangan i-corroborate kasi napakalinaw ng at napakayaman ng oral tradition ng Lubwaga na hanggang noong time ng Diego Silang natatandaan nila, pati yung genealogy nila ay mayaman, intact yung kanilang genealogical record up to the 1750s at least, hanggang doon sa time na kinonstruct yung kanilang mga rice terraces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Liegero. Now for Dr. Galang, we also have received several questions, but I'll just select two for in the interest of time. So, a question here was, maybe he perhaps didn't catch it, but he wanted to understand what were the economic interests that drove the Spaniards towards the copper industry. He compared this to the American period, for instance, where gold became the primary interest because of the Great Depression. And the second question is that how did copper mining differ from gold mining during the Spanish period? At least based on what you have observed, if you have been able to examine this. So these were the questions that we've gathered. So thank you, Dr. Galang.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. First, why did the Spaniards focus on extracting copper in Lipanto? As early actually as the second half of the 18th century, the Spaniards already had initiatives of exploring the mountainous regions of Luzon and Visayas to extract mineral resources aside of course from gold and silver. So sabi nila, baka kung walang silver like what they discovered in Latin America, baka meron pang ibang minerals na meron na ma-extract dito sa mga islands na ito. No? So isa sa mga nakita nila would be copper. In the 18th century, ang mga Spaniards, they focused on iron. Of course, in addition to gold, no? I mean, hindi naman nawawala palagi yung pagkagustuhan nila na mag-extract ng gold. Pero in addition to gold, kailangan during the 18th century, kailangan nila ng iron kasi meron mga Dutch wars, meron mga Moro raids, so they had to make weaponries, no? And yung iron during that time came from China, mostly from China. So they had to look for additional sites kung saan ma-extract yung iron. Then pagdating ng the very different, yung, according sa mga materials na nabasa ko, magkaiba yung proseso ng extraction ng iron ore sa gold ore. Sa I'm not particular with the technical details, but magkaiba yung proseso ng pag-extract ng iron ore at gold ore, specifically during the 18th century, second half of the 18th century. Then pagdating ng 19th century, of course, in addition to gold again, naghahanap ulit ang mga Spanyol, particularly the Spanish company, Cantabro Filipino Company, ng iba pang minerals, na metals and minerals na pwedeng nilang ma-extract. At nakita nila na copper ang isa. Yung iba, meron pang ibang mga metals, pero isa sa mga focus nila would be copper. Based doon sa mga reports ng Inspection General de Minas, magaling daw mag-extract ng gold ores at mag-classify ng gold ores ang mga Igorots, pero hindi sila ganoon kagaling when it comes to copper. Well, this is based on the reports of the Inspection General de Minas. So the Spaniards, the Spanish administrators of the company, decided to employ Chinese laborers, skilled laborers, to do the subterranean underground extraction of copper. So I think nasagot ko yung dalawa. No? Yung first is bakit mag-focus sa copper, and second, bakit focus on copper and why not gold? Tama ba? Yung gold, copper and gold. Siguro maganda rin banggitin kasi na uh, second half of the 18th century hanggang mga 1860s, 1870s, dyan talaga yung period na naghahanap ng mga windfall resources ang mga Espanyol. Ibig sabihin, naghanap sila na ano pa ba yung mga materials na pwede nilang extract from the Philippines. Second half, 1780s, 1770s, 1780s, during the Bourbon reforms, yung ganitong klase ng initiatives by the Spanish, particularly Spanish industrialists. Kailan bigyan natin emphasis yun kasi walang masyadong pera ang Spanish colonial government sa Philippines. So usually mga private companies ang nag-spearhead ng mga mining ventures. 18th century mga private individuals, hindi government. And pagdating ng 19th century mga private companies, mga Spanish companies or may mga German companies din later on na papasok. But basically foreign capital. Ibig sabihin hindi siya galing sa bulsa ng government.
Last quick question, sir. Is the journal, the publication that you've mentioned of this article available online?
Yes, it's available online. It's Southeast Asian Studies by Kyoto University.
Is it
Yeah,
free to
so
download, sir? Or
yes, you can download it for free. Yung prinesend ko ay short version ng article kasi nga 20 minutes lang yung presentation. So maraming mga detalye na hindi ko discuss din sa presentation. Yeah.
okay, that's good to hear. So we can download a copy of this online anyway. So some of the salient points, no, that we were not able to cover will be read there. So anyway, thank you very much everyone for staying with us beyond the allotted time. No, thank you for your participation in our panel this morning.